And it looks like it is just about that time. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Celine Figueroa, and I am from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science is pleased to partner with the International Institute for Indigenous Resource Management and the American Indian Commission to present Indigenous film. If you would like to contribute to the series and help keep these going, I'm about to send a link to our virtual donation bucket. Because we're not in person, we don't have a bucket that we can pass around, but hopefully you can contribute tonight because these films are fantastic and we'd love to continue them. Tonight we'll be using the chat feature. So if you have any questions, please go and comments, go ahead and put them in the chat. You can do that throughout the night. You might not be able to see each other's chats, but we can see them and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say. To begin tonight's event, I'd like to introduce Jean Rubin, Director of the Indigenous Film and Art Festival. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Celine, and welcome everybody. I'm Jean Rubin. With me is Merv Tano, President of the Institute. Welcome to our continuation of our 18th Indigenous Film and Arts Festival. As always, I like to start by thanking our sponsors. You saw the logos scrolling on the screen as you logged in. Without our sponsors, we couldn't bring you the festival. Our major sponsors this year are the National Endowment for the Arts, Kānaka Minolta, and AARP. Of course, you also saw the slide with our community partner logos. These are folks who provide venues, help promote the films, and in the case of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, have provided this wonderful virtual platform, which made it possible for us to transition from an in-theater festival to a virtual festival, I must say, without missing a beat. So many thanks to DMNS for all of their support. Tonight's film is New Zealand Wars, The Stories of Waitara. This is about the land wars waged between Maori and the British Empire in the 1800s. And this particular war waged for over 20 years. The film runs for 44 minutes. And when we come back, we'll bring on Maury Love. He is zooming in from Ātiawa. Some of you know Maury. He's been to most of our festivals when we've had them in person. He's on our board of directors. So he's giving us a wave. Maury will join us after the film. We'll give him a proper introduction and he'll be leading our discussion. So with that, let's roll the film.
Good evening. I'm Merv Tano with the International Institute for Indigenous Resource Management here in Denver, Colorado. In Ātiawa is a friend and colleague from going on 35, 36 years. Maurice Tefiti Love. Maury is a great friend and colleague. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Institute. We lean on him quite a bit for his sage advice. Maurice had quite a few positions in the private sector with government in New Zealand and with his tribe. For the purposes of this evening's discussion, probably the position that he had as the executive director of the Waitara Tribunal is probably the most relevant. They're all related, but that one I thought was it could bring a lot of observations and expertise of kind of the backstory of what really happens in these kinds of negotiations. So with that, we want to have Maury say a few words? Or
Sure.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou. Tēnei te mihi ki a koe Merv, rāo ko Jean. Ka nui te aroha ki a kōrua. Tātou mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Maury Lavahau no Te Ātiawa Taranaki ki te upoko o te ika. Kia ora tātou.
Okay, Maury, this reference to the confiscation of the tribal lands and talk about the devastating effects on the people of Te Ātiawa, the economic, political, social, and cultural, and on identity. Can you first talk about the kind of the talking past each other with the treaty, because this happened some 20 years after the treaty was signed, and yet there was a fundamental difference in how people seem to be viewing what their rights were under the treaty. So could you explain that, and then talk about some specific examples of those devastating effects of the land wars?
Sure. Yes, the treaty was signed in 1840. It actually wasn't signed in Taranaki, one of the places, but in essence, they say as it was signed in Wellington and Te Ātiawa people were part of that it brought Taranaki into there, but it didn't bring, as it had been thought, protection over land. The settlers had arrived in the 1840s, and their expectation was that they would be able to occupy much more of the land. The Māori in Taranaki, all the tribes really met in South Taranaki, to try and stop the sale of the land. They'd seen what had happened in Te Waipounamu, the South Island. The government agents had bought the land there, but that was not successful in the more populous North Island. So it was a land crunch, but surprisingly, it wasn't really the wars that did the damage, or potentially. It was, as usual, legislation that actually provided the alienation of the land, and it was a remarkably simple one. The wars were a method, and that method was to really for the government, aided by the military, to declare that Māori and Taranaki were in rebellion. And they used a version of the Irish rebellion laws to confiscate the land. 1.2 million acres in Taranaki, confiscated by the stroke, or several strokes of the pen, in that 1860s period. And basically, between 1860 and now, Māori have been trying to reverse what happened there. There were some reversals. There was a process where some of the confiscated land was returned, but it was returned to Māori who were deemed not to be in rebellion. and basically it was given to Māori who weren't in fact the owners of that. For Te Ātiawa, virtually all its land was confiscated. And of course, land was your means of survival. And so from 1860 to there were several pieces in between, but to 1881, when Māori had a number of them, including Te Ātiawa, had moved into a village, not a fortified one, but a large one, at a place called Parihaka, close in under the mountain. 1881, the frustration of a whole lot of things came to a head, and the village of Parihaka was attacked in November by a very large set of troops, fully armed. That's another story, but Waitara was the start of the land wars in New Zealand. It moved to other places, and the process was similar in many of the places. You got wars followed by confiscation, followed by some returns, but the main element that was really to alienate the land. And so it became the policy in those hard to get to places in that sense. So in the King Country with Tainui, they were similar to Taranaki. They were invaded, made rebels, land confiscated, and then in a number of other places. That policy eventually came to an end, and a different method was found to alienate Māori from their land. So, you know, briefly, that's kind of what happened. But over all of that time, there were battles, skirmishes, and things as Māori. They asserted, and you saw the start of the method to try and resist the alienation of land, and that was the pulling out of survey pegs. When it got to Parihaka, they developed some new strategies of resistance, and they started off by ploughing contested land. So they ploughed it up and planted crops. And what happened in that situation is the ploughmen were arrested and without trial and shipped out of Taranaki. The ploughmen, there was also another method was to fence the contested land and to put fences there. The fences were arrested and taken away, and as they took away all the men, the women started the ploughing, or continued the ploughing and continued the fencing, and the final blow in that was the invasion of Parihaka in 1881. And in essence, that was the action that kind of broke the back of Māori resistance. And you know, the remainder of the land was alienated, and very little was retained by the tribes.
So Maureen, we have a question in the chat room about the waging of the war. It says the The war went on for 20 years, but it sounds like it was essentially decided and over in the first 2 years. And after that, it was mostly the British invading the lands involved and pillaging the villages and lands. And Maori were not mounting much resistance, and I think meaning military resistance. Is this accurate?
Yeah, that's fairly accurate. The wars were costly, and these are British troops, so brought in. Many of them had been in India, and so there were seasoned regiments involved there, but it became costly to maintain that. And then, of course, they were using the strategy in other places. So they hadn't fully succeeded in Taranaki, but the confiscations really were much more effective than the wars in the end. So, you know, there were things going on there, and there was resistance right across Taranaki over those 20 years to Parihaka, and that was really the final blow. Eventually, those prisoners came back to Taranaki, but in essence, the land was gone.
Did the Ātiawa bring claims before the tribunal, the Waitangi Tribunal? And if they did, what were the results of those?
Right. All of Taranaki was brought together in a single Waitangi Tribunal inquiry. It was a large one, and Ātiawa were a part of that, as were the other 8 tribes. And the tribunal, it went through these things. It started off, and it issued its first report in 1996. It was anticipating that it would do 3 more reports, but Taranaki generally decided to go into negotiations, but on a tribe-by-tribe basis rather than as a collective. And Ātiawa started theirs in 2010, quite a long time after the tribunal had reported. It was a stop-start affair getting into negotiation for a number of reasons. These things are never quick, but they did achieve a deed of settlement by 2014. And the value of that settlement was some 87 million, but not surprisingly, most of that was in cash, as the Crown could only settle the treaty settlements with land that was Crown owned, or assets that were owned by the Crown. In Taranaki, the Crown didn't have that much. So, you know, the saying was for most tribes that as land was taken, land should be returned. But Taranaki, like other places, it largely didn't get land, and so had settled for some 70 million of that 87 million, 70 of it in cash.
There's a question from Melinda, who asked what film or books would you recommend to learn more about this history?
golly, there's a long list.
Right.
I mean, in a first instance, you can online get that first Taranaki report, and as an introduction to all of this, that report is very useful. There's a number of good books on this war without end. I think that's Hazel Riseborough. Vincent O'Malley, who you saw on the film there, he's done a number of, he has a number of books. He looks in quite detail at Waikato Tainui, Rangiriri, and the invasion there. So he's very. I've got his book sitting here. I can do a list. But you know, there are some very good books available on these things. I you know, I could do a list of ones, and they're still being written. Not so many from Māori writers at this stage, so that's a possibility later.
Yeah, if we could get perhaps Melinda's contact info in the chat, I can put together a list also, Maury, and then you know, we can post it to our website for anybody else who would like to see it.
Yeah, excuse me. I was just looking at a question there, and about the confiscation of land. You know, one of the reasons behind that was, or the logic and reasoning was to to settle soldiers in the areas for pacification purposes. So soldiers got a lot of that land with the idea that would stop the wars. Sorry, my yeah, so confiscation, of course you don't pay for, once you've confiscated the land, it's yours.
So Maury, what's the prospects of getting some of those lands that are such significant historical cultural sites into some sort of protected status?
I'll sort of start with the good news, sort of. You'll recall that the pa Pukirangiora was the one where there's big cliffs down to the Waitara River, and there was big earthworks, you know, the facing trenches and systems and things like that. That was made into a Department of Conservation reserve, and then it came across as part of the settlement for Te Ātiawa. But it's still managed by Department of Conservation. So I think it's, though there's been a change of ownership, I think there's still more to be done. There were some more of those sites, but not very many. I think if you saw in the film there, many of them are on private land that cannot be used for settlements, and frankly the tribe wouldn't probably look at buying them on the open market. They're very expensive dairy farms, and so the chance of those coming into any form of protection is probably pretty small.
Chinese need that milk powder.
well, New Zealand has depended on it, and China has been very reliably buying it, and unfortunately the price is still going up. So I don't think that some of the tribal organizations do have some of that land, and in each of the settlements that's the case. The last of the settlements was about the Maunga, the mountain, and the mountain couldn't be settled until all of the 8 tribes had their settlements, and then because they'd all have a share and an interest in that, along with the Department of Conservation. So that matters that the is being finalised in negotiation. I'm not sure whether if it isn't been finally settled, it's close. It's close to that. You know, that will take time, and you know, gradually sort of you know, having more and more influence over those particular lands.
See, we got a couple of questions from old friends.
Yes.
You want to get Angela's first and then Sandy's?
In terms of the youth.
Hang on, we
need to read
it because not everybody can see it.
Right.
So I'm not going to try to read the Maori, but the question is, what do you see as the way forward for Te Ātiawa? How are you guiding the youth, especially to meet the next several generations?
So there's a kind of administrative response to that, which might seem boring, but in terms of the settlements, a governance organisation is established along with a commercial entity. The job of the commercial entity is basically to keep the tribe alive and with sufficient funds to meet the tribal aspirations. So there's a what's called a kotaitanga. It's a set of governors. It's very active in Taranaki, and it has a very wide brief in what it's doing. You know, it's looking at education, it's looking at the environment in terms of all of those things that you see there. Taranaki has a lot of oil and gas, and you know, it's necessary for the tribe to be a part of all of those things. They've set up things on leadership and getting young Māori into not just governance, but everything else. The language revitalisation, the development of the marae and the sub-tribes in there. There's a lot of aspirations, and really communicating all of those things. So there are lots of what are called wānanga, and these are where people are brought together. It might be to share history. It might be to, as you saw, those ones there doing the poi. And the poi, those little balls on the end of a string swinging around. They're the Māori way of dealing with not having a drum. But you'll see that in Taranaki, we've taken the British drum from the invasion of Pariaka and use that. It's so the drum you see there is symbolically important. It's a reminder to the troops that though Pariaka was sacked and defeated, we're going to take your beat, and we're going to put our waiata to that beat, and so you heard in there that almost military sound of both the drum and the poi. That's you know, that so that the young generations, they're better equipped in terms of the language through early childhood, through kohanga reo, through to primary schools, right through to secondary schools, which can be all in Māori, right up to the university level. So those are coming forward. We don't have, we have the up to secondary level in Taranaki, but there isn't a university level there at the moment. So, you know, so things are growing. They're, you know, so settlements are being used to try and get that recovery, and you know, that's been a really useful part of that. Yeah, I don't know what else did I miss. Oh, there's one from Sandy on historians and treaty specialists love the British because they recorded everything. It doesn't matter if they were misdemeanors, if things were wrong, they wrote it all down and they kept it in very, very well kept archives. So in the treaty settlement process, Archives New Zealand hosted many researchers, the likes of Vincent O'Malley, but many Māori, who came to discover much that they had heard about orally, but here was the actual record of how that was all done. So yes, we thank the British for their very careful record keeping.
Right, the tribunal, Waitangi Tribunal reports are accessible online too, and they're quite good in terms of history as well. Before we go, Maury, you know, folks have probably heard about Taika Waititi, and you know, he's a filmmaker from Ātiawa, who's making some great inroads over here through Netflix and Hulu, etc. What is the role that folks like Taika play in kind of enhancing the resilience of Maori?
It may surprise you, but Taika is actually a product of often you see things in Māori that it all looks very serious and things like that. But there's when you're on the marae and you're speaking, those who are very good actually entertain the people listening to them, and they're the best. And it seems that gene Taika has, that he cannot help but even in things like Thor Ragnarok and stuff, these things come through. But it's a very old tradition of speakers being able to entertain, in essence, and to get messages across in that form. So though he comes from the opposite coast to me, from the East Coast, he brings, I think, a number of those skills that that a number of, he was used to kapahaka, and if you see the way that's basically doing haka, singing and all of that. He has that background, and you see that in fact in the way he moves. But he's there's a lot of what we would call whakapapa behind Taika, and he's a product of that. I think we in Taranaki wish that we had a little bit more of that East Coast swing. When they do the poi there, we're still a bit too much bound in grievance, but over there they swing, and they and their songs have that character. So he's brought that to the world, and I think that's a good thing.
There's also, a role that can be played, by other creative types, artists, musicians. What I'm thinking about is a few years ago, we had the film The Price of Peace that about Tamaiti. And one of the things that we saw in the film was the picture that he did, a painting that he did in the colors of the New Zealand Conservation Department. And he said it was the last time that those colors were going to be used. It was like, to me, it was very overt statement that we're finished with you. Your colors are being retired. So I don't know if you have some thoughts about other creative types that are playing that same role, enhancing resilience.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing, and in where Tami comes from, they have had returned a national park, and of course it was all in the livery of Department of Conservation, that the green and yellow. In Wellington, we've had some land returned, which is Department of Conservation, and it was my dearest wish to change the livery of the islands, and we've been doing that. So we've taken Tommy's word, but it's about branding and rebranding, and we use the opportunity to tell history, and particularly that underlying history that, and you can see in Taranaki, it lies hidden. It's not hidden for those who can see it, but most can't, in that sense. And in Taranaki and New Plymouth, you know, the divide is still, it's still present, and you know, they're still struggling to really resolve those old historical issues and try and redress the power. The settlements don't do it all, and there needs to be much more that's done. But you know, every step, if we can revitalize the language, revitalize the culture, and you know, and a lot of that is about imagery, and I use this one, and I can't remember the date, but the All Blacks, and it might seem an odd thing, a New Zealand team was playing England in Twickenham in London some years ago now, but they get someone to sing each team's national anthem, and New Zealand has a national anthem, and what most people didn't know, that it was written both in Māori and in English, and to that time it had only ever been heard in public in English. But a young woman called Hinewehe Mohi was given the honor of doing that song, and she sang that only in Māori, and now it's always sung in both languages, but then that was a very radical step. So each of those steps is important, whether it's films, in arts, in whatever, you know, that grows strong. So when Taika works with his Native American friends in the United States, they do, I think, a great service, and for everybody. So yeah.
All right. Okay, so
Thank you. I see when we see Celine's smiling face, we know
it's time to leave.
we're approaching the end of our session. Thank you, Maury. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thank the audience too for joining us as well.
I'm getting there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Of course, we do it for the audience. So without the audience, we wouldn't be here. So thank you so much. Thank you, Celine, and everyone behind the scenes at Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We are so appreciative of your stepping up and letting us transition into a virtual festival so we can keep providing these wonderful films and great discussions. So thank you to everybody, sponsors, community partners, audience. And hopefully we'll see everybody back next month.
Okay.
Thank you all. We'll see you back next month. If you gave us your email, we'll send you some additional resources, so keep an eye out for those. And thank you for continuing the conversation. Such amazing questions. And Maury, thank you so much. I learn, this is the second program I've done with you, and I've learned so much every time. So thank you all. We'll see you next time.
So long.